On this episode of Newt's World, the Chinese artificial intelligence app called DeepSeek rocketed to the top of the Apple App Store downloads chart over the weekend after its release last week by a Chinese startup. DeepSeek offers similar functionality to OpenAI's popular ChatGPT chatbot, answering questions and generating text in response to a user's questions. The immediate success of DeepSeek sent the tech-focused NASDAQ Composite Index down by 3% on Monday, with U.S. chipmaker NVIDIA down almost 17%. So how will the United States compete with China in the artificial intelligence race? Here to discuss China and artificial intelligence, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Dean Ball. He is a research fellow at George Mason University's Mercatus Center and author of the Substack Hyperdimensional. His work focuses on artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, and the future of governance. Dean, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is unbelievably timely, and I'm really grateful you could get us onto your schedule. Can you talk about the history of DeepSeek, when it began, and why it took the world by storm this last weekend?
Absolutely, yes. So DeepSeek is actually a subsidiary of a Chinese hedge fund called High Flyer. DeepSeek was created in May of 2023, so it's pretty recent. High Flyer, like a lot of quantitative hedge funds, that company has been using AI for a variety of different things for a long time. So they were already large-scale purchasers of the high-end computing hardware, the GPUs by NVIDIA, that are used to train and run large-scale AI models. And so DeepSeek has had a lot of very talented researchers working there for at least the last year. They've released models and research papers that people in the machine learning community have been paying attention to and impressed by for a long time. I myself first wrote about DeepSeek, I think, in May of 2024. It's been noticed by AI experts for a long time. And a couple of things happened in the last few months that are relevant, or really the last 1 month. In late December, DeepSeek released a model called V3. And this is like a language model similar to ChatGPT or Google Gemini. And it was particularly notable because the cost of training it was quite low. Now, I think there's some nuance about that figure that we can get into about why maybe it's not as low a figure as some people think. But certainly it was an impressive figure with some very impressive innovations that also they were quite open about. They shared exactly how they achieved these efficiencies, which is not something that we see from the frontier labs in the United States, most of them at least. And then about a week ago, they released a model called R1. And R1 was built on top of V3, and it's a reasoning model. So these models, it's a new style of model that was pioneered by OpenAI last September. OpenAI's version is called O1. DeepSeek's is called R1. And what it basically does is think about the question you've given it for a while before it answers you. And it does this in something called a chain of thought, where basically it's writing notes to itself almost is how you can think about it, sort of like writing down, okay, how might I solve this? Oh, look, I noticed I made a mistake there. Oh, okay, this approach isn't working. Let me go try something else, that kind of thing. And this is a capability that publicly only Google, OpenAI, and now DeepSeek have achieved. So it's definitely quite impressive to achieve it, though not particularly expensive to achieve it. And that model, and I think the app that they released for the iPhone combined, ended up sort of creating a sensation, that nobody quite predicted. I myself, back in September, I predicted that a Chinese company would replicate the O1 model from OpenAI within a few months. I would have never predicted that it would have caused NVIDIA stock to drop by nearly 20%. That was quite a shock to me. It's a bit of a surprise sensation in that regard, and that's basically how we got here.
As I understand it, the Chinese went to a very different system architecture and somehow are able to do faster better algorithms with much simpler chips that are much less expensive. I mean, is that a reasonably accurate statement?
There's a few things I would want to correct there. The first thing is about the chips. I think that's important. DeepSeek most likely is using somewhere between 10 and 50,000 of an NVIDIA chip that is basically the same performance as what OpenAI or Anthropic or Google are using. That chip was sold into the Chinese market as a result of a flaw in the 2022 export controls, which was the first kind of version of the Biden administration's export controls on high-end AI compute. So they used actually chips that are pretty similar in roughly similar quantity to what Frontier Labs have. So their computing power is significant here. And that's one thing that a lot of people are mistaken about. All evidence suggests that they had significant computing resources at their disposal. And the other thing about the sort of efficiency approach that they used, they're still using the same basic architecture that everybody else is using, which is called the transformer. That is a machine learning architecture that was invented in 2017 at Google. And that architecture, it's been improved many, many different times with many different people, and they're still using that same basic architecture. They made some novel improvements to it, but basically, over the last few years, the trajectory we've seen is that you can get about several 100% increase in efficiency from making this architecture and all the various algorithms that are involved more efficient. So American Frontier Labs have been doing those efficiency gains. The price of GPT-4 has dropped something like 99% in the last 15 months. So I would say that in terms of the efficiency gains that DeepSeek got, really it's actually about on trend. It's the trend that the whole machine learning, the whole frontier of the machine learning world is on. The thing that was surprising about it is not so much the efficiency itself. It's a Chinese company achieving that level of efficiency. But again, you can do that through having very intelligent engineers, and they certainly have that, just like we do.
If in a way it's not a dramatic change, why was NVIDIA hit so hard?
It's a really good question. I know some people who think that part of what was driving NVIDIA's stock price down on Monday was the tariffs that Trump was going to announce he was thinking about later that day, which he did. So there's some suggestion about that. I also think it's a good old-fashioned overreaction, though. The reality is that most people are not used to technology that moves this quickly, right? I mean, think about this fact. Think about the algorithmic efficiency improvements can get you 400 to 500% increases in efficiency per year. On top of that, the fastest chips get something like 150 to 200% faster every year. And on top of that, the companies are buying these chips in vastly greater quantities every year. So the pace of progress and speed here is truly exponential. And that is just something that I think we aren't used to in industrial outputs. We're not used to business moving with this kind of speed, but that's just where we are. So I think to people that watch the AI field closely, I think that all of this was somewhat less of a surprise with some exceptions. And I think, though, that there's a lot of people on Wall Street who sort of like the NVIDIA story and are aware of AI's potential in general, but maybe are just not aware of how quickly things are progressing here. And so in that sense, I think this is a bit of a wake-up call, should be a bit of a wake-up call for everybody that, yes, look at this technology, look at how much faster it's getting. And that's a story that's going to play out in both the United States and China.
Are NVIDIA's chips made in Taiwan or are they made in the U.S.?
For the most part, they're made in Taiwan. There is the Arizona foundry, the semiconductor manufacturing factory, that TSMC, the Taiwanese company, they built a factory in Arizona. That factory is not quite at the very cutting edge, but it's pretty close to the cutting edge. And they will be producing chips. The rumor is largely their chips are going to be for Apple and NVIDIA. So there will be some chips made in the United States, but predominantly we're talking about Taiwanese.
Well, the announcement last week of the group coming together to put in supposedly $500 billion in artificial intelligence. Is that mostly PR, or do you actually expect to see an enormous shift of energy and drive into that area?
I think the $500 billion number, definitely there's questions about how they're going to get to that level of investment. I don't think any of the investors that were mentioned there have $500 billion, in the bank. But I think the money's out there, and I think the promise is there. I basically believe the $100 billion number. And on top of that, Meta announced $65 billion in data center capital expenses this year. Microsoft is going to spend $80 billion on data centers. I would expect similar numbers from Amazon and Google. So all told, over the next 4 years, it wouldn't shock me to see well over $500 billion invested into AI data centers in the United States.
I was surprised. I saw one of these charts the other day that showed number of data centers by country.
Mm-hmm.
And we are overwhelmingly dominant.
Yes.
Is it really important, or is it just a temporary artifact?
Yes, it is definitely true that America is leading the world at this industrial infrastructure build out of AI compute. And I think it's going to be hugely important. We're not used to that in America. Chinese built all the high-speed rail. They built all this infrastructure throughout the developing world. They spent enormous amounts of money on that over the last decade or two. We are not used to leading on building things in the physical world. But in this case, we actually are. And I think that's going to be hugely valuable because despite what people are saying about the cost of this model having been so cheap to train, these efficiency gains that a company like DeepSeek is achieving, they mean that you can train a much better model. So if you were going to spend $1 billion on training a model, let's just say, and you found something that gets you a 400% improvement, well, then you can train a much better model for that same $1 billion. And so ultimately, this is a positive story. It's a positive story that the trajectory of AI is going to be really rapid and it's going to have quite profound capabilities, I think. And America will be in pole position, not just to build those models, not just to train them, but it's also very computationally expensive to run those models as well. We will be in a great position to be able to run those models so that individuals and businesses all throughout our economy, like a gigantic number of uses throughout the economy, it will be businesses and individuals and governments that are using AI to do all kinds of things, automate business processes, cure diseases. I mean, all kinds of things that some of which we can't even imagine yet. And those uses are just going to be enormously, enormously valuable, and we'll be in the position to lead in that regard.
Does that also imply that the capabilities of artificial intelligence will be permeating both the individuals, governments, and businesses much faster in the U.S.?
Well, I hope so, is what I would say. It means that we'll have the industrial capacity to do that. It doesn't necessarily mean that we will do it, because we could make it harder for businesses to adopt AI through bad regulation. There are about a dozen states and counting that are considering laws that I think would have not just have the effect of creating a patchwork of regulations, which is bad enough, but I think would also particularly impose a lot of compliance burdens, not on AI developers, actually, but on businesses trying to adopt AI. They'll have to adopt risk management plans and do these things called algorithmic impact assessments. And I think it could end up being a huge compliance burden, huge liability risk. And I think it could deter, especially among larger businesses, I think it could deter investment into AI and make our uses of AI somewhat less creative and bold. So we will be in the position in terms of the technological capability. And the question is whether our policymakers will allow that to occur.
So in a sense, the nature of AI would almost demand federal preemption to have one particular set of rules for the whole country.
I wish. I really wish. I've written a lot about federal preemption. I think it's a very hard thing to do politically, because you do need 60 votes in the Senate. Part of the reason America succeeded with the adoption of the internet is because Congress led with light touch and pro innovation laws that preempted a wide range of conceivable state policies. And I really do think that we should do something similar here. And I think that's not just an economic competitiveness issue. I think it's frankly a national security issue.
President Trump called DeepSeek a wake-up call for U.S. industries, and I get the sense that he wants to compete. He said to the House Republicans, "We need to be laser-focused on competing to win because we have the greatest scientists in the world." So in a sense, I suspect the Trump administration may be open to the idea of federal preemption to create one set of rules for the whole country.
I think the administration may well be open. I think the one thing that a lot of people can miss with this is people call this the AI race. And that's fine. I think we should be competitive and we should be pedal to the metal in that regard. But there's not some finish line that we're racing to. It's not like the nuclear bomb where you either have it or you don't, and you're kind of racing. The models are going to get better at a very significant pace. But the existence of a very capable model is not in and of itself winning. The country that wins in AI is going to be the country that has the most wide-ranging and creative and productivity-enhancing uses of AI. And so I think if we're not careful, there's a very good chance that, yes, America makes the leading models, and then the Chinese copy that technology in various ways, or maybe even engage in some intellectual property theft of various kinds. And then they duplicate those capabilities and they actually use them more efficiently than we do. And they use them more creatively and they disperse them throughout their economy more than we do. That would actually be very consistent with history. If you look at the early industrial revolution, the UK led technologically in the early industrial revolution, but it was America that took those ideas that were invented in the labs on the other side of the Atlantic, and we deployed them at scale here in the US, and we built the big factories. And something very similar could happen if we're not careful. And I think that that will involve not just sort of avoiding bad regulatory outcomes on AI, it'll actually involve regulatory reform to make it easier to do things in the physical world and easier to get cutting edge medicines approved and all that kind of stuff. There's just a ton that we need to do to make it so that we can get the best out of this technology.
They talk about an open weight model. What does that mean?
So the weights of an AI model, basically you can think of it as a simplification a little bit, but it's basically like a spreadsheet full of numbers. Billions or sometimes trillions of numbers. And those numbers constitute the functionality of that model. So an open weights model is a model where the developer releases those numbers to the public for free for anybody to download or modify as they see fit. That mirrors the history of open source software, kind of. Open source software is software where the code is released publicly. And for a variety of economic and technological reasons, open source software has become essential to the digital economy. There's open source software running on both of our computers right now. Almost every website you'll visit in the world is enabled by open source software. There's open source software at the heart of practically everything in the digital world. And so the question is there going to be something similar with AI? There are people who make closed source software and make a lot of money doing that. Apple would be a good example. Microsoft would be a good example. But the question is, will there be a similar kind of role for this freely available, free to modify AI, these AI models that are free to modify and super flexible Will there be a similar role for that in the future economy? And I think the answer is probably yes.
There must be an enormous number of people now already committed to working on artificial intelligence in its various formats. I mean, it's a much bigger system than I thought it was.
Yeah, I think it's a big industry. The funny thing about it is that there's not that many live players. I'd say in the US, it's Meta, Microsoft, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, XAI from Elon Musk, a handful of others. But those are the really big players in terms of developing these models. And in China, there's a few big ones as well. It is big, and there is a ton of investment that's basically already in the cards. These companies that are building the data centers, for example, they plan their capital expenses out years in advance. So we kind of already know what they're planning to spend. And so the certain levels of investment and expansion are just kind of already locked in.
I was almost startled. The capital investment by the biggest of these worldwide companies, and each company is 3 or 4 times the size of the NASA budget.
Yes.
The amount they're investing, the number of people they're hiring, the scale of the computational power they're building, it's really astonishing. And I don't think there's a single company in Europe that's in this league.
No, there's not a single company in Europe that's in this league. The industrial build out that is happening right now for AI is certainly the biggest peacetime industrial build out we've seen in our lifetimes, quite possibly the biggest ever. And in the fullness of time, it might even become larger, even as a share of GDP, than even wartime build outs.
There's a lot of concern about China in general. And now I think with DeepSeek, there's also concern about China challenging us on advanced artificial intelligence. How serious a threat do you think it is?
I think it's a fierce competition that we're in. It's a competition that's going to play out in a lot of different dimensions. We are in an overall economic and geopolitical competition with China. And that competition is going to be defined by innovations in science and technology. And innovations in science and technology, in turn, at the foundation of those innovations, I think increasingly will be AI. There's also going to be a whole digital infrastructure that gets created. And the question is going to be whose technology sets the global standard? Will American technology set the global standard, or will Chinese technology set the global standard? And I think we really want to do everything we can to ensure that American technology does set that global standard. There's a lot of ways in which American tech already does. We've been so successful over the last 50 years that in a lot of ways, I think many Americans are almost blind to the ways in which we have set the standard for how technology is used and deployed throughout the world. For us, it's like white paint. It's just there. We don't really think about it. But for China, which for the most part lacks that soft power, they perceive it quite readily and they want it. And that's a part of what the open weight and open source dynamic is about. That's why China has a government level, a CCP level priority is beating the US at open source. The question is not just who innovates faster, but whose technology is available more widely around the world.
And what's the biggest Chinese advantage in that competition?
I think the biggest single advantage is their industrial and mass manufacturing capacity. AI is going to enable so many new kinds of inventions. And one way to think of AI is like it's an invention for inventing inventions. So then the question becomes, okay, well, we have this new way to massively accelerate the rate at which new things are discovered and new things can be invented. And that's great. But who can actually make those things? Who can mass manufacture them? Who can figure out how to make them cheaply? And that's not going to just be a purely AI question. There's going to be an extent to which that depends on who has the factories, who has the supply chains. And that's an area where I think the Chinese have a quite large advantage over us in not all, but many important domains.
Now, the other side of that is, it seems to me that the sheer number of innovative efforts here. Is the cost of developing the computational power for artificial intelligence so great that only really large companies can compete?
I think certainly to build the biggest foundation models, as they're called, is going to be quite capital intensive. At the same time, one of the things that DeepSeek shows us is that because those costs of developing that foundation model go down so quickly over time, smaller players can catch up relatively quickly. They cannot necessarily catch up, but they can at least, if you see a certain capability today, you should expect that a much wider range of actors will be able to achieve that same capability in 18 months. But another way to think about it is these really expensive foundation models are just that. They're foundation models. And there are so many things that can be built on top of them. And I think that's really where the entrepreneurship and startup opportunity is going to be. Let's take legal services. One of the things that has really impressed me about the most cutting edge models today is that they're getting really good at legal reasoning. And so I can ask them really complicated questions about tort liability and reasoning about various public policy outcomes and get answers that are starting to feel like white shoe legal analysis. But it's not obvious to me that an existing white shoe law firm is going to be the company that delivers that capability to the world. Instead, I think, well, maybe there's a new kind of startup that can exist that can provide Skadden Arps level of legal analysis to everyone for a far lower cost. And that's one of a billion startups that you can imagine.
One of the examples of the scale of at least semi-artificial intelligence that is actually occurring, and I think almost nobody's covering it, is there are now, I think, 3 cities that have agreed to have experiments with taxis that have no driver. Well, I don't think most people have thought through. Once that becomes so reliable that you don't worry about it, you're going to have an entire revolution in the nature of cars, and you're going to have a revolution, as they already have at Tesla. I mean, the sheer volume of data that Tesla absorbs every day, because I think every Tesla is basically an information gathering. I tell people it's actually a computer company with cars. It's not a car company with computers.
I think that's exactly right. There's going to be a certain extent to which the companies that have the lead are going to be the ones with the highest quality data and also the access to the best compute and all that kind of stuff. But I think that you can totally imagine a world in which a company like OpenAI, their explicit goal is to develop a system within the next few years that is better than humans at all economically valuable tasks. Now, I think you can have a lot of quibbles with that definition. And like maybe a better way to think about it would be all current economic or like most current economically valuable tasks, but new things will become economically valuable for humans. So I think you can quibble with that definition, but either way, it's a very profound idea of having systems that are so capable. And you can imagine a world where like, well, we have the everything machine and it can do everything. So we're just going to, as a company, do everything. But the question will be, well, that means that you're regulated by every regulator in the world. You're subject to every single law. You're subject to all of the liability that every single actor in the economy is subject to. Do you want all that? As a single firm, can you do that? There's going to be an extent to which, yes, the foundation models get better and better, but there's also going to be people that are uniquely positioned to sort of serve particular industries and particular needs in the economy using the foundation models, but those startup firms will tailor themselves to the particular regulatory requirements, legal requirements, liability, customer needs, etc., economic dynamics of that industry. So I think that's probably the way it will play out.
It occurred to me that probably the largest set of stored data is Google.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of training artificial intelligence systems, they ought to have a huge potential advantage.
I think they do have a big advantage there. One interesting question, actually, is Google owns YouTube, and a lot of these companies are training on video data. And it's actually an interesting question of, is Google actually less able to use YouTube data because they own it? And there are therefore contractual obligations that they have made with their users in the form of the YouTube terms of service that actually might make it harder for Google to, and make it easier for, again, particularly a Chinese company. China has access to YouTube too. They can take all the YouTube videos and train on them, and there might not be the same intellectual property concerns that they have.
And they have all the TikTok data.
Yeah, that's right. One way to think about this is just, it's like an old economic lesson that there's an economist I learned about this concept from named Friedrich Hayek, who's a 20th century economist who talked about how information is spread unevenly throughout the economy. Not just different firms, but also different individuals have differential access to information. So there's all these asymmetries. And the thing that might become truly valuable in the future might be the information that's proprietary to a firm, the things that only you know, or the things that only your company knows. And those might be the things that are valuable because the AI models, in some sense, might know everything that's public. There's this common thing that people say about how all the information in the world is on the internet. And to that, I say, you haven't tried to find a lot of things out because there's a lot of information that's not on the internet. For example, if you want to get something done in Congress, the internet's not really going to tell you how to do that. The internet doesn't tell you which staffers have relationships with one another, like friendships with one another, where are their political tensions, like how do you actually kind of operate the machinery of Congress. You had a lot of information as Speaker of the House that was in your brain that no one else in the world knew. And that kind of thing might just become even more valuable in the future.
Somebody made the point we're gathering up all this data, but it's actually data that's electronic, and that's not the same as the real world. And we don't yet have a very good model for gathering up data about the real world as opposed to the mathematical representation of that world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's true. It varies by field. We have lots of good data from biology. A lot of it is hard to get, though. So it's like in total, there's a ton of good data about biology, but how do you get access to it all? Companies like Tesla or Waymo, which is a subsidiary of Google, another self-driving car company, they've spent a decade collecting naturalistic data from the real world of streets, of how people drive and what that's actually like. And we're just now getting to the point that that enormous volume of data can be used to make pretty darn good self-driving cars, but it took a long time. And so when you think about things like robots, for example, a lot of people are excited about humanoid robots that could live in your house and cook meals for you. Well, that's going to take a ton of data. The internet doesn't have tons and tons of point of view videos of people doing chores around their house. Someone's going to have to go out and collect that. And that's going to be a non-trivial exercise.
Do you think as AI continues to develop and both continues to become more powerful and more intrusive, do you think there's a point where sort of consumer reaction may slow it down and lead to rejection? Or do you think it's just inevitably going to continue growing?
I think there will absolutely be social bottlenecks that will slow down the diffusion of the technology into the world. Even today, we've had the internet now for 30 years, and a huge number of customer service things can be resolved without picking up the phone and calling a customer service line. But pretty much every company still has to maintain a customer service line because there's a lot of people who just prefer to talk to a person. That's going to continue to be true. I wouldn't be surprised, in fact, if AI systems become so capable that there's sort of a broader movement coalesces that's kind of a backlash to all of this. Because I think there will be people who find the changes to be quite shocking. And I think that'll slow down the diffusion of the technology all over the world. At the end of the day, I think it's an inevitability, just like the internet was, just like the smartphone was. These things will happen, but they will take time. And that's one of the reasons there are people I know in the AI community who think that just a few years from now, the whole world is going to be utterly transformed. and it's going to look like something out of science fiction in just 5 years because of how capable the systems will be. And I would say that even if the systems are that smart, there's just absolutely no way something like that is going to happen, because there will be what I suppose you could call in the field socio-technical bottlenecks, which you might put more simply as people not wanting to adapt that quickly. And I think that's actually healthy.
We're going to come back to you again and again, I think, over the next couple of years. You are right in the middle of a field that is, I think, going to continue to accelerate and deepen and be even more important. And Dean, I really want to thank you for joining me. Our listeners can follow the work you're doing by subscribing to your Substack, Hyperdimensional, at substack.com/@DeanWBall, and by visiting the Mercatus Center's website at mercatus.org. And we'll have a link to your Substack on our show page at Newt's World. So thank you very, very much for educating us.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you to my guest, Dean Ball. You can get a link to his Substack, Hyperdimensional, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.